Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner and viewer. We are going to discuss the centrifugal federal inputs for the environment protection in India. The need for centrifugal inputs for the environment protection for India is felt since very long period of time because as we have seen in the federal dimension of environment protection in India that the centrifugal tendencies of the environmental protection in India has resulted into the alienation of the people and the state being the trustee of all the natural resources happens to manage the entire environmental resources and to pursue the agenda for the environment protection in India. But at times we feel that the centrifugal federal inputs for the environment protection in India is something a sine qua non in the entire environmental planning and governance. The reason happens to be that the centrifugal federal inputs for the environment protection of India is required because the federalism and the environmental law requires not only the centripetal but centrifugal tendencies, and the centrifugal tendencies tries to see that the environmental law from the perspective of the states at one hand. So, if all the environmental laws have a tendency to go to a state, then the centripetal tendency might be lacking some kind of the very important inputs which can be realized only from the local people and the regional aspirations and by the indigenous people, by the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, by the forest dwellers, by the farming community, by the breeders community, by the conservers of the biodiversity. So let there be a kind of a tendency where the environmental law leads instead of going to the centripetal tendency should go to centrifugal, and then all the laws which permeates from the centrifugal then away from the center and coming to a kind of the center of the people. If we see the entire discourse on the international environmental law, which has been handed down, then we find that the human has been put at the center of the environment. Here, the discussion relates to any kind of a discussion which we can say that when Shukumbar write the small is beautiful, and the small is beautiful, while saying that a small is beautiful, we require some kind of a planning which are having some local and federal and indigenous input so that instead of going for a very mega developmental project, let's we have a smaller project. And the Shukumba's thesis about the small is beautiful places the development of man into the center. The very purpose of the law and the economy is to develop the man. Its purpose is not to develop the machine and the material goods. So if we want to develop the man, then we must go to the grassroots environmentalism. We must go to grassroots federalism. We must go towards the centrifugal inputs and the centrifugal identity. This is also important because that environmental and federalism, which bestow evolved from the local responsibility to the national responsibility, then there is a sense of consensus and the sense of consent, and any law which is being passed by the center, the very purpose of the law is to see that the compliance of the law, not the deviance of the law, any law which evolved from the local responsibility or the local people to national, to regional, to national, and centrally regulated legal framework evokes massive compliance. Otherwise, any law which lacks the necessary and the essential inputs from the centrifugal identities, then that law is going to have more deviances, and that law is going to be observed more in breaches than that of the compliance. The purpose, the essence of today's lecture, dear learner and viewer, to look at the centrifugal inputs for the environment protection in India is to track and and trace the possibility of a radical shift from centralization to, to localization. And from centralization to localization is something very important, and that is to be required in matters of policy, in matters of the central laws, in matters of the delegated legislation, and wherein the center remains in power, the center remains at the center. Nonetheless, the state and the other identities and administrative accolade and paraphernalia, which is a satellite to the state and the center, must have a direct impact on the policy, and their autonomy of will, their autonomy of aspiration, and their communitarian benefits are to be best incorporated into the environmental law. And as we have said in the last lecture, when we were discussing about the unitary character of the Indian Constitution and federal character of the Indian Constitution, when when we discussed about the a center with a strong centralizing tendency, when we discussed that it is having a quasi federal state, when we discuss about its centripetal tendencies, we discuss that it tries to see an overwhelming power of the center to keep. Why? Because in the historical annals, if you look at the constitution, then when there was a strong center, and then there was peace, tranquility, and in the society and in the country. So taking recourse from the history, the Indian constitution happens to favor a strong center. Otherwise, once the center happens to be slightly neutral, slightly facilitator, and slightly happens to be having less kind of a power and a monitoring and observatory power, then there are chances that the local and the state can spearhead their in such a way that the weakening of the center will not be very favorable to very notion of national integrity and unity of the nation. And that's why if you look at the Indian constitution, we find the copious references of the integrity and the unity of the nation, unity and the integrity of the nation. That kind of the question and the phrases have been replicated in the Constitution of India at so many copious references and have been awfully quoted in the Constitution of India. The idea here is that the center remains strong. Nonetheless, we must have some kind of a policies, and that policy must reflect some basic conscience of Indian federalism, which is going to accommodate the federalism in such a manner that the environmental legislation, using a quasi-judicial, quasi-federal approach with the union predominating in the policy and implementation, must create some kind of the space, as we have seen, again quoting to Agenda 21, that think globally and act locally was a kind of a scenario which is best suited to environmental law making and environmental legislative activism. Having said so, when we try to see the Indian Constitution from the point of view of the centrifugal tendencies instead of centripetal tendencies, then we come across to a kind of amendment which have taken place by 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, which resulted into insertion of the schedule 11th and the 12th to the Indian constitution. These changes were supposed to be a very robust and democratized environmental governance from the grassroots, and it proves very effective by giving coordination and participation of the people, in the sense that this grassroots democracy and the environmental federalism go hand in hand. And it is because of this kind of the constitutional notion which has been changed. The other changes which have taken place is something that moving from state to concurrent, or moving from a state to union list. There might be certain circumstances, and to be very categoric, the example happens to be what we can say. The classical example to this is that where somewhere the state abdicated its power to center in matters of uniformity of water law in this country, and that came into 1974. But it is the abdication of the power of of the state to the center in order to bring a uniform law, because it was felt that in matters of river pollution, that having a very piecemeal, having a very fragmented, having a very sporadic approach happens to be very half baked legislation. Therefore, to have a very effective legislation on any item like the water, right from 1952 to 1974, the 12 years that the Indian government have mooted the very idea to have a comprehensive legislation. Having this kind of an exception, that where the power which has been bestowed to the state have state themselves in order to bring uniformity and some kind of the changes and a compliance of an overarching law, abdicated power to the center under Article 252 of the Indian Constitution to have this law stands apart. But the reason happens to here, that example may be taken from two angles. The one angle is that where the power has been conferred on the estate happens to abdicate his power to the center. Then why we can complain of the centripetal tendencies of law, and why we are again arguing for the centrifugal federal inputs for the environment protection in India. But both have a relative merit. Here, what the state has given, it is not out of consent, it is by a consensus of the state, it is by the ratification of the state. Here, the purpose of this lecture is not to see that the centrifugal federal input is juxtaposed to centripetal tendencies. The idea is that if both kind of the federalism, be that centrifugal federalism or the centripetal federalism, the net result happens to promote a cooperative federalism. And the case of the water law enactment in 1974 under Article 252 of the Indian Constitution is something, is a sense and a classical example of the cooperative federalism. So it is not always true to hold this thing that the centripetal tendency are detrimental, but sometimes the centripetal tendencies, if it is done with the consensus and the consent of the state to achieve the broader common good and goals, then that centripetal tendencies of the environment under Indian federalism is not to be contested altogether. But what we try to see, that whether the Indian federalism, be that centripetal or be that centrifugal or be that cooperative, be that a strong centralizing tendency, be that quasi federal state, the idea is to adopt a kind of an accommodative policy which is well informed, widely shared, widely commonly participated by the people of this country, to see that what kind of the laws in the arena of the environment and conservation and biodiversity, water, wildlife, forest are, do we really require. It's not that something the top down approach, but something from the below can be also be seized as a novel opportunity to refurbish the environmental law in this country. And that way we will be discussing the grassroots democracy, or Panchayati Raj, the democracy at the doorstep of the people, that a lot of committees in India from 1970s till 1992 have been constituted to confer and to devolve power to the people, and this devolution of the power has been made possible by 73rd and 74th Amendment. And this 73rd and 74th Amendment, what it did actually, that it led to the insertion of two schedules, uh, chapters 9th and 10th A was added to the Indian Constitution, and that has been amended. And 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment, once it confer power to municipal corporations, and secondly, it confers power to Panchayati Raj institution, and as a basic unit of the governance under the constitutional framework. So the Panchayati Raj institution and the municipal corporation both has assumed the role of a constitutional status, as it has been envisaged as one of the uh, most basic policy and the fundamental policy for the governance of the country, that the constitution will promote the Panchayati Raj institution. That has been fulfilled. And the Gandhi also dreamed that power to the people, the democracy at the doorsteps of the people, and what the Gandhi has MK Gandhi, the father of nation, has envisioned, that has been incorporated in the directive principles of the state policy. And what has been provided in the directive principles of state policy have led to its culminating point by 73rd and 74th Amendment, which confers detailed powers either to the to municipal corporation and the Panchayati Raj institution. So much so, it inserted two new schedule. One is known as the 11th schedule, another is the 12th schedule into the Indian Constitution. That way, this study is very important because this decentralized environmental governance, which has been introduced by 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment, combines the environmentalism and federalism in a true sense of the term, and how it confers the environmentalism and federalism in true sense of the term, strengthening the very grassroots democracy and promoting the goal of environmental protection and conservation, and as well as sustainable development. How it has been done, we will see and peruse the aspect of the 11th schedule, which has been refurbished under Article 243G, as we have a union list, as we have concurrent list, as we have the estate list, where the union can also pass the law, the state can also pass the law. It remains exclusive domain of the union. However, it remains in the domain of the state. But in certain circumstances of emergency, the union can also pass the law. But there are certain items of lawmaking, and the grassroots democracy and environmental federalism and governance, that has been put into 11th schedule. Let us see that what 11th schedule talks about. The 11th schedule confers power on power on the 11th schedule, that deals with kind of a planning regarding the land improvement. We have seen some of the items which has been mentioned on the aspect of the environment. As we have mentioned in the last lecture, that environment per se has not been mentioned in either of the three schedule, but we have wildlife, we have forest, we have agriculture, we have animals, we have quarantine, we have diseases, we have waterways, we have ponds and lakes. There are a large number of fisheries and navigations. Large number of items have crept into in either union list or concurrent list or a state list, but we find a clear demarcation and a change in departure, that what has been envisaged under these three lists of the 7th schedule. The 11th schedule is something very practical, very real, and very pragmatic, in the sense of taking environmental concern to the environmental protection and sustainable development. We see the land improvement, the soil conservation, the land reform, water management, minor irrigation, watershed development, social forestry, farm forestry. minor forest produce, fisheries, drinking water, health and sanitation, non-conventional energy, and maintenance of community asset or common property resource, what is called as that. We see that the enumeration of the 11th schedule is something very basic, very essential, very focused, a very diverse, and it really sees that there is a radical shift, what we can say, from the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution than that of the 11th schedule. The items which are listed in the union list, concurrent list, state list, and the item which were listed in the 11th schedule, we find that there is a marked difference in their envisioning the entire notion of grassroots environmental governance, and what you can say that the centrifugal federalism in India. And with that, what the 12th schedule talks about, one leads to the Panchayati Raj institution, the another lead to the municipal corporation, the 73rd constitutional amendment and 74th constitutional amendment. And in that reference, when we see and peruse Article 243 of W of the Indian Constitution, then we find the 12th schedule and what items that the municipality is supposed to undertake, what item the Panchayati Raj is supposed to take in the arena of the environment and sustainable development. We find that in the 12th schedule, we have urban planning, we have we have regulation of land use, we have the construction activities, we have water supply, we have the waste management, we have urban forestry, we have the protection of environment. Here it remains to be said that what we have asserted in the last lecture, that schedule 7th to the Indian Constitution does not contain any word relating to environment protection within quote. But if we see that 12th schedule, then there is a clear enumeration of protection of environment, and that is something very important. And even when we talk of the word sustainable has ever mentioned in the Constitution of India, then it is again we see that the word sustainable forestry or sustainable agriculture or some kind of the sustainability norms which were totally missing under the Indian Constitution, then we find that these 11th schedule and the 12th schedule to the Indian Constitution is really a very encompassing in to be very contemporaneous in incorporating the principles of environment protection and sustainable development. We see what is important in at the level of the panchayat and the villages and the rural India, and what is required in an urban India, that both rural and Indian, because we have to also be very careful about the very idea, what the idea is that the rural and urban divide is also important. That has to be studied sociologically, and that has to be studied legally, because the rural and urban divide may result into depletion of the resources, extinction of the resources, dwindling resources. And once the environmental resources are being dwindled, denuded, and diminished by the the urban style of consumption pattern, then the rural and urban divide will be there. And once the rural and urban divide will be there, then it means that the question of sustainability is that 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 the urban India will develop and the rural India will sustain. This is not a kind of a logic which can be bought upon. This is not a kind of a reason that is to be accepted, but this reason can be severely contested, that if we want the environment protection in its own perspective and the perspective of the biodiversity, forest, and wildlife, then we must ensure that the sustainable development goal should remain equal to urban India and equal to rural India. It's not that the urban India will always try to develop in such a way and all kind of the consumption which the urban India is having to have a tendency and propensity to consume, the rural India will suffer by denudation of the environment. That kind of the sense and the caution has been also we find, because these institutions promises federally sound environmental regime, because these institutions try to address environmental issues through participatory management, not a top down approach. And there is a sense of community participation, environmental participation, be that then the entire legislative echelon and the flow of the power happens to from center to a state, to district, to municipal corporation, to panchayat, to NGOs, and then citizen, and then in the rural and urban India, that the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, which inserted the two chapters which are substantive, which gives the ambit, power, and functions of the Panchayati Raj institution vis-a-vis the municipal corporation in India. Then the schedule 11th and 12th gives a platter of autonomy, and that autonomy pertains to a large number of items that include promotion of cultural, educational, and the ecological aspect. So the word ecological aspect, the word protection of environment, is something which has been mentioned in the constitution in article 48A, but it has not been added to either of the list of the seven schedule. But if we compare and contrast the seventh schedule with that of the 11th schedule and the 12th schedule, we find the enumeration of the items which pertains to the environmental governance in this country is under these two schedule 11 and 12 schedule have far reaching consequences in bringing a grassroots democracy in matters of environment, in matters of sustainability, and at the same time to promote a sense of centrifugal federalism under Indian constitution. And that way what we can say that this amendment, which is very important in its sense, that despite the discursive shortcomings of the Indian federalism, be that the strong centralizing tendency, be that the quasi federal character, be that the centripetal tendency, be that the unitary character of the Indian constitution, how gradually, right from 1950 to 1992, in the 40 years, that the directive principles, the goal to devolve power to the people, and that too in relation to the environmental governance, happens to be a kind of a reality in India. And then we see that the Indian federalism from quite a different perspective, and that perspective which has been given under 73rd and 74th amendment, especially the perusal of the powers and functions of the municipal corporations and the Panchayati Raj institution vis-a-vis the enumeration of the 11th schedule and the 12th schedule, and having given a very careful study of each and every items which have been devolved and conferred for their participation in the lawmaking, in the environmental governance, and conferring power to the people, appears to be a very salubrious development in Indian constitution, in Indian federalism, and especially the kind of the federalism that the environment protection and the sustainable development requires in this country. We feel in a more comfortable position and in a very sustainable position with the 73rd and 74th amendment. And that is why it's not a surprising to see that the entire corpus of the environmental law, be that Environment Protection Act or Air Act or Water Act or EIA law, when these laws are being with aligned with international agreement, at the same time we saw a greater refinement of these laws, although these laws are passed to foster respect to international law, and these laws are in their preambularization has not mentioned about the constitution or any kind of an indigenous demand for this law. Nonetheless, what we find, the legal framework of these law have given a rise of what we can say is a kind of a federal friendly regime to see the classical center state centripetal paradigm is no more a modus operandi, and the de novo modus operandi, which is now operational, talks about the centrifugal federalism, and it talks about cooperative federalism, which is required under the Indian law. And to bear this testimony, besides 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, we can see logically that the entire regime of the delegated legislation which has been passed, and as it has been recommended, be that the environment law, be that the water law, be that the air law, be that the hazardous waste law, be that biomedical waste law, municipal solid waste, e-waste, batteries management and handling rule, coastal resource rule, then ultimately the rule making power has been conferred by delegated legislation. Here we try to see the plethora of the delegated legislation which have swelled in ranks and files in the arena of the environmental law making is a direct impact of what we can say that somewhere the federal distribution of the power and the environmental agenda, which have been underpinned into the three lists of the Constitution of India, have ultimately moving from a more centripetal tendencies to centrifugal tendencies, and we always advocate that the centrifugal federal inputs are sine qua non and essential for environment protection and sustainable development, alongside the very novelty attached to the cooperative federalism. With this, my dear learner and viewer, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.